When historians write about prisoners of war in the Pacific theater of World War II, the narrative follows a familiar pattern. Stories of forced labor on the Burma Railway, accounts of men enduring years of starvation and disease, tales of escape attempts and prisoner solidarity. These stories are important and deserve to be told, but they represent only part of the truth. Missing from most historical accounts are the experiences of female prisoners of war, thousands of women who endured captivity under Japanese forces and whose stories have been systematically marginalized, overlooked, or deliberately suppressed for 8 decades. Tonight, we examine why female POW experiences have been excluded from mainstream narratives, what we know about their specific challenges in captivity, how survivors fought for recognition after liberation, and why recovering these stories matters for understanding World War II completely and honestly. This isn't a story designed to shock or sensationalize. It's a story about historical erasure, about how gender shapes both wartime experiences and post-war memory, about the remarkable resilience of women who survived impossible circumstances, and about the ongoing effort to recover voices that were silenced. The women held as prisoners by Japanese forces came from diverse backgrounds. Military nurses comprised one significant group. When the Philippines fell to Japanese forces in early 1942, dozens of American and Filipino Army nurses were captured. These women had been serving in military hospitals, treating wounded soldiers under combat conditions. When Singapore surrendered in February 1942, British and Australian nurses became prisoners. When Hong Kong fell in December 1941, nurses from multiple Allied nations were taken into captivity. These weren't combat troops, though they had served in war zones. They were medical professionals, explicitly protected under international law. The Geneva Convention of 1929 specified protections for medical personnel. Those protections would be systematically violated. Civilian women represented another large category of prisoners: missionaries who had spent years or decades in Asia, teachers at international schools, businesswomen and entrepreneurs, wives and daughters of colonial administrators, long-term residents of territories that Japan conquered, places like Malaya, Singapore, Hong Kong, Java, Sumatra, and other islands of the Dutch East Indies. When Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia and the Pacific in late 1941 and early 1942, these women were trapped. Some tried to evacuate but couldn't reach ships before ports fell. Others stayed, believing they would be protected as neutrals or civilians. Most simply had nowhere to go. Indigenous women from conquered territories also became prisoners, though their status was often ambiguous and their treatment frequently worse than Western women. Filipino, Chinese, Indonesian, Korean, and Burmese women found themselves in captivity or conditions functionally indistinguishable from imprisonment. The total number of female POWs held by Japanese forces is difficult to establish precisely. Record-keeping was poor or deliberately obscured. Estimates suggest several thousand Western women were formally imprisoned in designated camps. Tens of thousands of Asian women were held in various forms of captivity. The uncertainty itself is significant. It reflects how poorly documented female prisoner experiences have been compared to male POW populations, where numbers were more carefully tracked. International law at the time, specifically the Geneva Convention of 1929, provided protections for prisoners of war. These included adequate food and shelter, medical care, protection from violence, humane treatment, and the right to correspond with families. Japan had signed but not ratified the Geneva Convention. Japanese authorities stated they would follow its general principles. In practice, they violated virtually every provision. For female prisoners, these violations took forms that reflected gender-specific vulnerabilities. Understanding what happened requires examining multiple dimensions: the physical conditions of captivity,
the specific challenges women faced, the inadequate post-war response, and the systematic erasure of women's experiences from historical narratives. Let's begin with the documentation challenge itself. Why do we know so much about male POW experiences and so little about female prisoner experiences? Several factors contributed to this disparity. First, military documentation systems focused overwhelmingly on male service members. Women in military roles were recent additions in most Allied forces. Nurses held military rank but operated somewhat outside traditional command structures. Documentation of their capture and imprisonment was often incomplete or inconsistent. For civilian women, documentation was even more fragmented. They weren't part of military systems, so their imprisonment wasn't tracked through those channels. Some were registered with colonial authorities, but those records were often destroyed when territories fell. Many women simply disappeared into the chaos of war with no official record of their capture. Second, post-war investigations and war crimes trials focused primarily on camps holding male POW prisoners. These investigations documented conditions, compiled prisoner lists, and gathered testimony systematically. Camps holding women received far less investigative attention. Some were barely examined at all. This reflected broader patterns where women's wartime experiences were treated as less significant or less worthy of official documentation than men's experiences.
Third, cultural attitudes about gender and war shaped what was documented and remembered. Military history traditionally focused on combat, an overwhelmingly male domain. Prisoners of war were seen primarily through military lenses. Women prisoners didn't fit comfortable categories. They weren't combat soldiers. They disrupted narratives of male military heroism and sacrifice. Many military historians simply didn't know how to incorporate female experiences into their frameworks. Fourth, the nature of abuses women suffered created barriers to documentation. Women in captivity faced gender-specific forms of violence and exploitation. Cultural taboos around discussing sexual violence meant many survivors never spoke publicly about what they endured. When they did speak, authorities often failed to record their testimony properly or treated it as too sensitive for official documentation. Families sometimes discouraged survivors from speaking about certain experiences, fearing shame would attach to the family. This pressure to remain silent meant that decades of potential testimony were lost. By the time historians began seriously researching female POW experiences in the 1980s and 90s, many survivors had died without ever documenting their stories. Fifth, survivor testimony itself was often dismissed or minimized. When women did report their experiences, they sometimes faced skepticism. Military authorities questioned whether civilians could reliably report on prison conditions. Male POWs sometimes disputed female prisoners' accounts, arguing that women hadn't experienced real captivity because they weren't subjected to heavy labor details or certain forms of punishment. This dismissal reflected gender biases that assumed women's experiences were less significant or less credible than men's. Sixth, the geopolitical context after World War II created incentives to minimize certain types of documentation. Japan became an important American ally during the Cold War. This created political pressure to limit war crimes prosecutions and move toward reconciliation. While the worst atrocities couldn't be ignored entirely, there was a tendency to focus on crimes that were safely concluded rather than ongoing issues requiring continued attention. For female prisoners, this political dynamic meant their experiences received less scrutiny and their claims for justice were often sidelined in favor of diplomatic convenience. The result of these combined factors is that we have far less documentary evidence about female POW experiences than about male experiences. What we do know comes from fragmentary sources, memoirs published decades after the war by survivors who broke their silence, oral history interviews conducted by researchers in recent decades with elderly survivors, scattered official documents from camps that held women, war crimes trial transcripts from the few cases that addressed crimes against female prisoners, letters and diaries that survivors preserved and eventually shared. These sources pieced together allow some reconstruction of what female prisoners endured, but enormous gaps remain. Many women's stories were never recorded. Many experiences were never discussed. Many documents were destroyed. The historical record is incomplete in ways that can never be fully remedied. Understanding this documentation challenge is crucial because it explains why female POW experiences have been overlooked. It wasn't simply that historians weren't interested, it's that the evidence was systematically underdocumented, and what evidence existed was often inaccessible, dismissed, or lost. Now let's examine what we do know about women's experiences in captivity. The physical conditions in camps holding female prisoners were comparable to those in male camps in many respects, which is to say, terrible. Prisoners were held in overcrowded facilities with inadequate shelter. Food rations were grossly insufficient, typically consisting of small portions of rice and thin soup. These starvation rations led to rapid weight loss, weakened immune systems, and epidemic diseases. Sanitation was primitive or non-existent. Water supplies were often contaminated. Diseases including dysentery, malaria, beriberi, and tropical ulcers spread rapidly through camps. Medical care was minimal. Prisoners who fell seriously ill often died because there were no medicines, no equipment, and sometimes no trained medical personnel, though ironically, many of the prisoners were themselves nurses. The climate in Southeast Asian and Pacific locations where most camps were situated was harsh. Extreme heat, monsoon rains, and tropical diseases made survival difficult. Prisoners who had lived in temperate climates struggled to adapt to these conditions while malnourished and imprisoned. Work details varied by camp. Some female prisoners were forced into agricultural labor, growing food they weren't allowed to eat. Others worked in camp kitchens, laundries, or maintenance. The labor was exhausting for malnourished prisoners. Guards enforced discipline brutally. Beatings were common. Prisoners could be punished for minor infractions or for no reason at all. Some women were subjected to prolonged standing, stress positions, or isolation as punishment. The guards' behavior was unpredictable, which created constant anxiety. These conditions, starvation, disease, forced labor, brutal discipline, were similar to what male POW experienced. Both male and female prisoners suffered terribly under these conditions. Thousands died. But women faced additional challenges that male prisoners didn't experience in the same ways. Medical needs specific to women were completely ignored. Menstruation continued for some prisoners, particularly early in captivity before severe malnutrition stopped menstrual cycles. Prisoners had no access to any supplies for managing menstruation. No cloth, no pads, nothing. Women had to improvise with whatever scraps of material they could find or simply endure the discomfort and humiliation of having no way to manage their periods hygienically. This might seem like a small issue compared to starvation and disease, but for the women experiencing it, the constant discomfort and inability to maintain basic dignity was profoundly distressing. Pregnancy occurred in camps, resulting from various circumstances. Some women were pregnant when captured. Others became pregnant during captivity. Pregnant women received no additional food rations, despite needing more nutrition. In camps where everyone was starving, pregnant women starved faster and more severely. Their bodies tried to sustain both mother and developing fetus on rations insufficient for one person. The results were tragic. Miscarriages were extremely common. Women's malnourished bodies couldn't sustain pregnancies. Miscarriages without medical care were traumatic, painful, and sometimes fatal. Infections from incomplete miscarriages killed some women or left them seriously ill. For pregnancies that continued to term, childbirth in camp conditions was extraordinarily dangerous. Women gave birth in barracks with no medical equipment, often with only other prisoners to help. Even when prisoner nurses were present, they had no instruments, no medications, and no sterile conditions. Many women died in childbirth or from postpartum complications. Infants born in camp faced terrible odds. Maternal malnutrition meant mothers couldn't produce adequate breast milk. There was no infant formula or appropriate baby food. Most babies born in Japanese POW camps died, usually within days or weeks of birth. The few infants who survived did so against overwhelming odds and often suffered developmental problems from severe early malnutrition.
The psychological impact of losing children in captivity was devastating. Mothers blamed themselves for deaths that resulted from deliberate camp policies denying pregnant women and infants adequate nutrition and care. This guilt and grief affected survivors for the rest of their lives. Women also faced unique vulnerabilities regarding exploitation. Some women prisoners were selected for assignment to work in officers' quarters or administrative areas. These assignments sometimes came with slightly better food or conditions, creating difficult moral calculations. Women had to weigh whether accepting such assignments was survival strategy or something that would later be seen as collaboration. The ambiguity of these situations created lasting moral injury. Some women who survived partly through such assignments carried guilt for decades, even though they had made reasonable choices under impossible circumstances. Children in camps created additional challenges, particularly for mothers. Some women were imprisoned with their children, ranging from infants to teenagers. Trying to keep children alive while barely surviving yourself was agonizing. Mothers gave their own meager food rations to children. They tried to protect children from guards' brutality. They watched helplessly as children suffered from hunger and disease. Some children died in captivity, traumatizing surviving mothers. Others survived but were profoundly affected by the experience. Growing up in a prison camp left psychological scars that affected these children, now elderly if still living, for their entire lives. The social dynamics within camps were complex. Women prisoners came from different national, class, and cultural backgrounds. British colonial wives, Australian nurses, American missionaries, Dutch colonials, and women from Asian territories all found themselves imprisoned together. These differences sometimes created tensions. Class and racial hierarchies from the pre-war colonial system didn't disappear in camps. Some women struggled to adapt to treating others as equals when pre-war social structures had placed them in hierarchical relationships. But captivity also created solidarity. Women shared food, cared for each other when sick, and supported each other psychologically. Friendships formed in camps lasted lifetimes. Many survivors stayed in contact with former fellow prisoners for decades after liberation, maintaining bonds forged through shared suffering. The camp administration varied considerably across different locations and over time. Some commandants were marginally less brutal than others, though all operated camps that violated international law. Some camps had somewhat better conditions due to location, supply access, or administrative decisions. Others were death traps, where prisoners died rapidly from starvation and disease. As the war progressed and Japan's military situation deteriorated, conditions generally worsened. Supply lines were disrupted. Camp administrators had fewer resources. Discipline sometimes broke down, leading to increased brutality. By 1944 and early 1945, many camps were scenes of mass death from starvation and disease. Liberation came in August and September 1945, after Japan's surrender. Allied forces reaching camps found emaciated survivors, evidence of mass death, and conditions that shocked even experienced soldiers. For survivors, liberation was both joyful and traumatic. They were free, but often in terrible physical condition. Many required months of medical care before they could travel home. Some died shortly after liberation from illness contracted in camps, or from complications when their bodies couldn't handle normal food after years of starvation. The post-liberation experience for female POWs was complicated in ways that male prisoners often didn't face. Military nurses were officially part of military services, so they had some structure for repatriation and support. But military systems weren't well designed to support female service members. Benefits, medical care, and recognition systems had all been designed primarily for men. Civilian women faced even more challenges. They weren't part of military systems at all. Repatriation was often chaotic, support was minimal. Some women found themselves essentially abandoned after liberation, having to find their own way home with no assistance. Medical care after liberation focused primarily on physical rehabilitation, treating malnutrition, diseases, and injuries. Psychological care was essentially non-existent. PTSD wasn't recognized as a formal diagnosis until decades later. Survivors suffering from severe trauma received no specialized mental health support. When women returned to their home countries and communities, they faced varied receptions. Some received warm welcomes and support. Others found that people didn't want to hear about their experiences. "You're home now, time to move on," was a common attitude. This pressure to remain silent about traumatic experiences prevented healing and created lasting psychological problems. For women who had endured sexual violence in camps, the stigma was particularly severe. In the 1940s and 50s, victims of sexual violence were often blamed and shamed. Women who tried to speak about such abuse often faced skepticism, judgment, or outright accusation that they must have done something to invite or deserve it. This societal response to sexual violence meant most survivors never spoke about those aspects of their captivity. They carried that trauma privately, often developing severe PTSD that went untreated for decades. Some women never told anyone, including spouses and children, about sexual abuse they had endured. The silence was self-protective, but also isolating and psychologically damaging. Family dynamics were often difficult for returning survivors. Women who had been gone for 3 or 4 years found that life had continued without them. Children had grown up. Spouses had adapted to their absence. Returning meant reintegrating into families and communities that had changed. For women who had changed profoundly through their traumatic experiences, this reintegration was extraordinarily difficult. Some marriages failed because husbands couldn't understand what wives had been through, or because the trauma made intimacy difficult, or because the women themselves had been fundamentally changed by their experiences. Career prospects were often limited. Women who had been nurses sometimes found that they couldn't continue in nursing. The trauma made patient care too difficult, or physical health problems prevented them from working. Civilian women who had been teachers or in other professions faced similar challenges. The years lost to captivity had disrupted career trajectories. Some women never fully recovered economically from their imprisonment. Recognition from governments and military organizations was inadequate. Male POWs received medals, pensions, and recognition as heroes who had endured captivity. Female POWs received less recognition and often inadequate compensation. Military nurses received some benefits through military pension systems, but these often didn't reflect the severity of what they had endured. Civilian women received even less. Some countries provided minimal compensation, others provided nothing. The distinction between military and civilian prisoners meant that many women fell through bureaucratic cracks, receiving no support despite their suffering.
War crimes trials prosecuted some Japanese officials for mistreatment of prisoners, but these trials focused overwhelmingly on camps holding male military prisoners. The specific experiences of female POWs received minimal attention in war crimes proceedings. Some trials did address crimes against women, but these were exceptional. The vast majority of crimes against female prisoners were never prosecuted. Perpetrators faced no consequences. This failure of accountability reflected broader patterns where crimes against women were treated as less serious or less worthy of prosecution than crimes against men. It also reflected the lack of documentation about female prisoner experiences. Prosecutors couldn't pursue cases they didn't know about or couldn't document adequately. The geopolitical context also mattered. As Cold War tensions developed, there was pressure to conclude war crimes trials quickly and move toward reconciliation with Japan. This meant that many potential cases were never pursued, including most cases involving female prisoners. The legal framework for prosecuting war crimes was also limited. International law at the time didn't adequately address gender-specific crimes. Sexual violence in war wasn't recognized as a serious war crime deserving systematic prosecution. It was treated as unfortunate but inevitable, or as private matters rather than crimes against international law. This legal gap meant that even when prosecutors were aware of crimes against women, they often lacked adequate legal tools to pursue them effectively. Sentences, when they were imposed, were often light compared to sentences for other war crimes. This sent a message that crimes against women were less serious, a message that discouraged survivors from coming forward and that perpetuated impunity. The historical narrative that emerged in the decades after World War II largely excluded female POW experiences. Books, documentaries, and academic studies of Pacific War prisoners focused almost exclusively on male experiences. The Burma Railway, Changi Prison, and other sites associated with male POWs became well known. Sites where women were held remained obscure. This wasn't necessarily intentional exclusion in most cases. It reflected the documentation gaps discussed earlier, the focus of military history on combat and male experiences, and the fact that most historians researching POW experiences were men who naturally gravitated toward male subjects and had better access to male veterans willing to discuss their experiences. But intentional or not, the effect was systematic erasure of women's experiences from mainstream historical narratives. Children learning about World War II heard about male POWs, but rarely about women. Museums and memorials commemorated male prisoners, but often overlooked women. The popular culture representation of POWs, films, novels, television programs, depicted almost exclusively male experiences. Several factors began changing this pattern starting in the 1980s and 90s. Feminist historians started specifically researching women's war experiences and questioning why existing histories excluded them. They approached surviving female POWs and encouraged them to document their stories. Some survivors, reaching old age, decided to break decades of silence and share their experiences. They wrote memoirs, participated in oral history projects, and spoke to researchers and journalists. Their testimony began filling in gaps in the historical record. The women's history movement more broadly created space for these stories to be heard. Academic interest in gender and war increased, leading to more research on how war affects women differently than men and why women's experiences have been systematically marginalized. Legal developments also contributed. The establishment of international criminal tribunals in the 1990s to prosecute war crimes in Yugoslavia and Rwanda included explicit attention to sexual violence and gender-based crimes. This legal recognition that sexual violence in war was a prosecutable war crime encouraged more historical research into past conflict where such crimes had occurred but not adequately addressed. The Rome Statute establishing the International Criminal Court in 1998 explicitly included rape, sexual slavery, enforced prostitution, forced pregnancy, and enforced sterilization as war crimes and crimes against humanity. This represented major progress in international law's recognition of gender-specific crimes. As interest grew in historical cases of wartime sexual violence, researchers began examining World War II more carefully, including treatment of female POWs. The result has been a flowering of scholarship on female POW experiences over the past 30 years. Numerous books, articles, documentaries, and academic studies have documented what women endured and analyzed why their experiences were excluded from earlier historical narratives. Museums and memorials have begun including women's stories more systematically. Educational materials are being revised to include female POW experiences. This represents significant progress toward a more complete and honest historical accounting, but challenges remain. Many survivors have died without ever documenting their experiences. The documentary gaps can never be fully filled. Some aspects of what happened will remain unknown. Political sensitivities around addressing wartime crimes continued to complicate efforts at full historical accounting. Diplomatic relations between countries affect willingness to confront past atrocities. This is particularly relevant regarding Japanese war crimes, where issues of acknowledgement, apology, and compensation remain contentious. For female POWs specifically, the progress toward recognition has been slower and more limited than for male prisoners. While significant scholarly work has been done, mainstream awareness remains limited. Most people still know little or nothing about women's POW experiences. The memorialization and commemoration of female prisoners remains inadequate compared to male prisoners. Survivors who are still living, now in their 90s or older, deserve full recognition of what they endured. They deserve acknowledgement that their experiences were as significant as male POWs, that their suffering was real and profound, and that the historical neglect of their stories was unjust. They deserve apologies from the governments and institutions that failed to document their experiences, failed to prosecute crimes against them, failed to provide adequate support after liberation, and failed to honor their suffering and survival appropriately. Several specific survivors deserve mention for their efforts to document and share experiences of female POWs. Vivian Bullwinkle was an Australian Army nurse who survived the Bunka Island massacre in February 1942. where Japanese soldiers executed a group of nurses and wounded soldiers. She was shot but survived by feigning death and then spent 3.5 years in captivity. After the war, she testified at war crimes trials and spent decades advocating for recognition of what female POWs endured. She gave numerous interviews, spoke at schools and conferences, and worked to ensure that nurses' experiences were documented and remembered. Her advocacy helped bring attention to female POW experiences.
Betty Jeffrey was another Australian nurse imprisoned in Sumatra. She kept detailed notes throughout her captivity, despite the danger of guards discovering them. After the war, she published these notes as White Coolies, one of the first published accounts of female POW experiences. Her documentation provided crucial evidence of camp conditions and helped establish historical record. Agnes Newton Keith was an American writer living in North Borneo when war began. She was imprisoned with her young son for 3 years. After liberation, she published Three Came Home, a memoir of her captivity that became a bestseller and was adapted into a film. Her work brought mainstream attention to civilian women's internment experiences. Darlene Deibler-Rose was an American missionary imprisoned in the Dutch East Indies. After years of silence, she eventually published a memoir documenting her experiences. Her account provided valuable testimony about conditions in camps holding civilian women. Lavinia Warner was a Dutch civilian imprisoned in Java. Decades after the war, she testified about specific abuses in her camp, contributing to historical documentation and war crimes investigations. These women, and others like them who documented their experiences, performed crucial historical work. By breaking silence and sharing their stories, they ensured that future generations would know what female POWs endured. Their courage in confronting traumatic memories and speaking publicly about experiences they had been pressured to hide deserves recognition and gratitude. But we must also remember the many women who never spoke, who carried their trauma privately, who died without their stories being recorded. They too deserve commemoration, even though we know less about their specific experiences. The challenge of recovering women's stories is complicated by the fact that many took their stories to their graves. Researchers can interview surviving women and examine available documents, but enormous gaps will always remain. Acknowledging these gaps is important. We should be honest about what we don't know and resist the temptation to fill gaps with speculation. At the same time, the patterns that emerge from available evidence allow reasonable conclusions about what female POWs collectively experienced, even when individual stories are lost. We know that conditions in camps were brutal, and that thousands of women died from starvation, disease, and violence. We know that women faced gender-specific challenges, including inadequate attention to medical needs specific to women, dangers around pregnancy and childbirth, and specific forms of exploitation and abuse. We know that post-war support and recognition were inadequate. We know that their experiences were systematically excluded from historical narratives for decades. These patterns are well established, even though many individual stories remain unknown. Understanding why women's POW experiences were erased from history requires examining multiple intersecting factors. Gender bias in military institutions and historical scholarship played a major role. Military history has traditionally focused on combat, command decisions, and battlefield experiences, domains associated with men. Prisoners of war were incorporated into military history frameworks, but primarily as military personnel whose captivity was part of their service experience. Women didn't fit these frameworks as comfortably. Most female prisoners were either nurses, who held military rank but operated somewhat outside traditional command structures, or civilians who weren't part of military systems at all. Historians trained to think about war in military institutional terms often didn't know how to incorporate women's experiences. Cultural attitudes about appropriate subjects for women also mattered. In the mid-20th century, there were strong norms about what women should and shouldn't discuss publicly. Sexual violence, reproductive health, and other private matters were considered inappropriate for public discussion. Women who had experienced such things were expected to remain silent. This created a double bind for female POW survivors. If they spoke about the full range of their experiences, they violated cultural norms and risked being seen as immodest or inappropriate. If they remained silent, their experiences went undocumented. Most chose or were pressured into silence, contributing to historical erasure. The Cold War political context created incentives to limit documentation of all Japanese war crimes, but this affected female POWs particularly severely because their experiences were already marginalized. When decisions were made about which crimes to prosecute and which to set aside for diplomatic convenience, crimes against women were most likely to be set aside. This reflected both gender bias, crimes against women were seen as less serious, and political calculation. Issues involving sexual violence were diplomatically awkward and easier to avoid than crimes like forced labor that affected male POWs. Documentary practices in military and governmental institutions were designed primarily around male service members. Forms, records, and reporting systems assumed male subjects. Women who didn't fit standard categories were often poorly documented or overlooked entirely. After the war, bureaucratic systems for veteran support, compensation, and recognition were similarly designed around male experiences. Women who tried to access these systems often found they didn't quite qualify, or that their specific experiences weren't recognized categories for compensation. Academic historical practice, until relatively recently, didn't emphasize gender as an important analytical category. Historians might note in passing that prisoners included some women, but they rarely analyzed how gender shaped experiences or why women's voices were missing from sources. Without such analysis, the systematic exclusion of women from historical narratives continued unquestioned. All these factors reinforced each other. Cultural attitudes discouraged women from speaking, lack of documentation made it easy for historians to overlook women, existing historical narratives focused on male experiences, which seemed to confirm that male experiences were what mattered. Institutions designed around male service members marginalized women. The result was systematic, multi-generational erasure of women's POW experiences from historical memory. Recovering these experiences requires deliberate effort to counteract decades of erasure. It requires seeking out surviving women and encouraging them to share stories they may have kept silent for decades. It requires examining fragmentary documentary evidence and reconstructing what happened, even when records are incomplete. It requires questioning existing historical narratives and asking what voices are missing. It requires taking women's experiences seriously as historical subjects deserving full documentation and analysis, not as footnotes to male experiences. The comparison between male and female POW historiography is instructive. For male POWs, we have extensive documentation. Military records tracked prisoners, documented deaths, and compiled information about camp conditions. After the war, numerous organizations supported former POWs, collected their testimony, and preserved their stories. Historians produced voluminous scholarship on male POW experiences. Specific camps and experiences are well documented and widely known. For female POWs, documentation is fragmentary. Military records, where they exist, are often incomplete. Civilian women's imprisonment was poorly tracked. Post-war support was minimal. Organizations supporting former POWs often focused on male prisoners. Historians produced relatively little scholarship until recently. Many camps holding women are barely known beyond specialists. This disparity reflects systematic devaluation of women's experiences and contributions. It doesn't reflect actual differences in significance or suffering. Female POWs endured comparable suffering to male prisoners, but their experiences have received a fraction of the historical attention.
Correcting this imbalance requires conscious effort and sustained commitment. It requires dedicating resources to documenting female POW experiences while survivors are still living. It requires revising educational materials to include women's stories prominently, not as afterthoughts. It requires museums and memorials updating exhibits to represent women's experiences accurately. It requires continued historical research filling gaps in knowledge. It requires legal and political efforts to ensure that survivors receive appropriate recognition and compensation. And it requires cultural shift in how we think about war and gender. War affects entire societies, not just male soldiers. Women's experiences of war, as combatants in resistance movements, as civilians under occupation, as prisoners, as refugees, are central to understanding war's full impact. Marginalizing these experiences creates distorted historical understanding. The specific lessons from female POW experiences remain relevant today. Understanding how gender shapes vulnerability in conflict zones helps inform contemporary humanitarian efforts. Recognizing patterns of gender-based violence in historical conflicts helps identify and prevent such violence in current conflict. Acknowledging the systematic erasure of women's experiences from historical narratives encourages vigilance against similar erasure today. The legal framework that has developed to address gender-based war crimes emerged partly from recognition of historical failures to prosecute such crimes adequately. The cases of female POWs in World War II contributed to understanding that international law needed to explicitly address sexual violence, forced pregnancy, and other gender-specific crimes. The Rome Statute's provisions on gender-based crimes represent progress, though implementation remains challenging. International humanitarian organizations have developed protocols for protecting women in conflict zones and supporting survivors of gender-based violence, informed partly by historical understanding of what happened when such protections were absent. These practical applications of historical lessons demonstrate why recovering women's POW experiences matters beyond academic interest. These stories inform contemporary efforts to protect vulnerable populations and prevent atrocities. The intergenerational impact of female POW experiences continues today. Survivors pass trauma to children and grandchildren. Families still grapple with legacies of experiences that were never fully discussed or understood. Some descendants of survivors are involved in efforts to document and commemorate their relatives' experiences. They conduct research, advocate for recognition, and ensure that stories their mothers or grandmothers carried in silence are finally told. This intergenerational work is important. It honors survivors by ensuring their experiences are recorded. It provides closure for families who knew something terrible had happened but never knew full details, and it contributes to historical completeness. The diplomatic dimensions of addressing wartime crimes remain sensitive. Japan's relationship with countries whose nationals were POWs continues to be affected by questions of historical acknowledgement, official apologies, and compensation. Progress has been uneven. Japan has acknowledged some war crimes and offered apologies for some actions, but controversy continues over adequacy of acknowledgement, sincerity of apologies,
and appropriate compensation. For female POWs specifically, recognition has been even limited. The specific forms of abuse women suffered had received less official acknowledgement than other categories of war crimes. Survivors and their advocates continue pushing for fuller recognition, but progress is slow. Political considerations often take precedence over justice for survivors. Governments may be reluctant to press for full accounting of crimes against their nationals if doing so would complicate important diplomatic relationships. This political calculus has meant that many survivors never received adequate recognition or compensation from Japanese government or from their own governments who failed to adequately protect and support them. The challenge of historical justice, how to address past atrocities when decades have passed, most perpetrators are dead, and political contexts have changed, is complex. Perfect justice is impossible at this distance from events, but meaningful steps remain possible. Acknowledging what happened clearly and officially, providing recognition and compensation to surviving prisoners, supporting efforts to document and preserve survivor testimony, ensuring that educational materials accurately represent women's experiences, creating memorials and commemorations that honor female POWs appropriately. These steps don't undo past suffering or fully compensate for years of neglect, but they represent commitment to truth, acknowledgement of injustice, and effort to ensure that women's experiences are finally recognized as they should have been all along. The broader question of how societies remember war is central to this issue. War memorials typically emphasize male military service. They focus on combat, sacrifice, and heroism defined in traditionally masculine terms. Women's contributions and suffering are often relegated to the margins or overlooked entirely. This reflects broader gender dynamics in how societies understand and value different types of contributions. Military service has been culturally constructed as masculine endeavor, with all the valorization and recognition that implies. Women's roles in war, including but not limited to military service, haven't received equivalent recognition. Changing this requires rethinking how we memorialize war. It requires ensuring that memorials represent diverse experiences, including those of women. It requires expanding understanding of what counts as war service and sacrifice to include experiences beyond combat. Some progress is being made. Newer memorials in museums increasingly include women's experiences. Educational programs are incorporating more diverse perspectives, but much work remains. The majority of existing war memorials and historical narratives still center male experiences. As we approach 80 years since the end of World War II, the window for documenting survivor testimony directly is closing. The youngest female POW survivors are now in their 90s. Many have already passed away. Within the next decade, direct testimony from survivors will no longer be available. This creates urgency for current documentation efforts. Every interview with a survivor, every memoir published, every piece of testimony recorded adds to the historical record before it's too late. Historians working in this field feel particular urgency. They know that what isn't documented now will be lost. They're working to interview every surviving female POW they can locate to encourage publication of memoirs and letters, to search archives for any additional documents that might exist.
This race against time affects how we think about historical responsibility. Present generations have opportunity to document these stories before it's too late. Future generations won't have that opportunity. What we fail to document now will be lost to history permanently. This creates moral imperative to act now, to prioritize documentation of women's experiences while it's still possible. The challenge is compounded by the fact that many survivors are reluctant to discuss traumatic experiences even now, 80 years later. For some, the trauma remains too painful. For others, cultural attitudes absorbed in their youth still make them reluctant to discuss certain topics publicly. Researchers working with elderly survivors must be sensitive to these concerns, while also recognizing the historical importance of documenting experiences before survivors pass away. Some survivors have found that sharing their stories late in life has been healing. Breaking decades of silence, having their experiences acknowledged and validated, knowing their testimony will help future generations understand what happened, these have provided sense of closure and purpose for some survivors. But others have found that revisiting traumatic memories is too distressing. They prefer to keep their silence, and that choice must be respected, even as it means some stories will be lost. The ethical dimensions of historical documentation require balancing respect for survivors' well-being and choices with historical imperative to document important events. Researchers must navigate these tensions carefully, never pressuring reluctant survivors, but also explaining why their testimony matters and encouraging them to share what they're comfortable sharing. The role of family members in this process is significant. Sometimes survivors who won't speak to researchers will share stories with children or grandchildren. Families can then decide whether to make those stories available to historians. This creates opportunity for documentation while respecting survivors' preferences about who they talk to. Some of the most valuable testimony has come through family mediation. Descendants interview elderly relatives, record their stories, and then share those recordings with archives or historians. This allows documentation while maintaining survivors' comfort with the process. The material that has been documented, memoirs, interviews, archival research, has produced some clear conclusions about female POW experiences, even though many gaps remain. Women held as prisoners by Japanese forces suffered terribly. They endured starvation, disease, brutal conditions, and inadequate medical care. They faced gender-specific challenges that male POWs didn't experience in the same ways. Many died in captivity. Survivors carried physical and psychological scars for life. Their experiences after liberation were often difficult, with inadequate support and recognition. Their stories were systematically excluded from historical narratives for decades. Recent historical work has begun correcting this exclusion, but much remains to be done. These conclusions are well supported by available evidence. They allow us to understand overall patterns, even though many individual stories remain unknown. They also highlight the importance of continuing documentation and research efforts. The more we learn about female POW experiences, the more we understand about war's full impact. The comparison to other historical experiences of women in wartime is instructive. Women under occupation, women in resistance movements, women in combat roles, women as refugees, all have been systematically underrepresented in historical narratives. The pattern of initial exclusion followed by eventual recovery of women's voices through deliberate historical effort appears across many contexts. This suggests that historical erasure of women's experiences is systematic, not accidental. It reflects deep structures of gender biases in how history is documented, taught, and remembered. Addressing this erasure requires sustained effort across multiple domains. Educational systems must incorporate women's experiences prominently. Historical scholarship must continue recovering women's voices. Museums and memorials must represent women's contributions and suffering accurately. Media representations of historical events must include women's perspectives. Legal and political systems must recognize women's specific experiences in conflict and address crimes against women appropriately. The progress that has been made toward recovering female POW experiences demonstrates that change is possible, but it also demonstrates how much effort is required. Decades of work by feminist historians, survivor advocates, and others have produced significant scholarship on female POWs. Yet mainstream awareness remains limited. Most people don't know this history. The work of historical recovery is never finished. Each generation must decide how to remember and teach about the past. Currently, there is opportunity to ensure that female POW experiences are preserved and transmitted to future generations. But with such effort, these stories could easily slip back into obscurity. The lessons from female POW experiences extend beyond understanding World War II. They teach us about how historical narratives are constructed and whose voices are included or excluded. They teach us about how gender shapes both lived experiences and historical memory. They teach us about the importance of documentation and testimony. They teach us about resilience and survival under extreme conditions. They teach us about the inadequacy of post-war justice systems and need for improved legal frameworks addressing gender-specific crimes. These are lessons applicable to understanding many historical and contemporary situations. They inform how we think about war, justice, memory, and gender across various contexts. As we conclude this examination of overlooked female POW experiences and their erasure from history, several key points deserve emphasis. Thousands of women were held as prisoners by Japanese forces during World War II. Their experiences involved terrible suffering comparable to what male POWs endured, plus additional gender-specific challenges. After liberation, they received inadequate support and recognition. Their experiences were systematically excluded from historical narratives for decades. Recent historical work has begun correcting this exclusion, but much remains to be done. These conclusions are well supported by available evidence. They allow us to understand overall patterns, even though many individual stories remain unknown. They also highlight the importance of continuing documentation and research efforts. The more we learn about female POW experiences, the more we understand about war's full impact. The comparison to other historical experiences of women in wartime is instructive. Women under occupation, women in resistance movements, women in combat roles, women as refugees, all have been systematically underrepresented in historical narratives. The pattern of initial exclusion followed by eventual recovery of women's voices through deliberate historical effort appears across many contexts. This suggests that historical erasure of women's experiences is systematic, not accidental. It reflects deep structures of gender biases in how history is documented, taught, and remembered. Addressing this erasure requires sustained effort across multiple domains. Educational systems must incorporate women's experiences prominently. Historical scholarship must continue recovering women's voices. Museums and memorials must represent women's contributions and suffering accurately. Media representations of historical events must include women's perspectives. Legal and political systems must recognize women's specific experiences in conflict and address crimes against women appropriately. The progress that has been made toward recovering female POW experiences demonstrates that change is possible, but it also demonstrates how much effort is required. Decades of work by feminist historians, survivor advocates, and others have produced significant scholarship on female POWs, yet mainstream awareness remains limited. Most people don't know this history. The work of historical recovery is never finished. Each generation must decide how to remember and teach about the past. Currently, there's opportunity to ensure that female POW experiences are preserved and transmitted to future generations. But with such effort, these stories could easily slip back into obscurity. The lessons from female POW experiences extend beyond understanding World War II. They teach us about how historical narratives are constructed and whose voices are included or excluded. They teach us about how gender shapes both lived experiences and historical memory. They teach us about the importance of documentation and testimony. They teach us about resilience and survival under extreme conditions. They teach us about the inadequacy of post-war justice systems and need for improved legal frameworks addressing gender-specific crimes. These are lessons applicable to understanding many historical and contemporary situations. They inform how we think about war, justice, memory, and gender across various contexts.
As we conclude this examination of overlooked female POW experiences and their erasure from history, several key points deserve emphasis.
For descendants of female POWs, this historical recovery has personal significance. They're learning about experiences that shaped their mothers' or grandmothers' lives. They're understanding trauma that affected their families across generations. They're contributing to ensuring that their relatives' sacrifices are finally recognized appropriately. For society broadly, recovering these stories contributes to more accurate and complete understanding of World War II. The war wasn't just combat between military forces. It affected entire populations in complex ways. Understanding how different groups experienced the war, including female POWs, provides fuller picture of war's impact. The historical erasure of female POW experiences reflects patterns that continue today. Women's contributions and suffering in contemporary conflicts are often overlooked or minimized. Addressing historical erasure helps create awareness that can prevent similar oversights in documenting current events. The diplomatic and political dimensions of addressing past crimes remain relevant. Governments still grapple with how to acknowledge historical atrocities, particularly when doing so complicates international relationships. The experience of female POWs, where crimes were systematically under-prosecuted and survivors inadequately compensated, provides cautionary example of what happens when political expediency takes precedence over justice. The legal framework that has developed to address gender-specific war crimes represents progress, but implementation remains inconsistent. Historical cases like female POWs in World War II remind us why robust legal frameworks and a commitment to enforcement matter. They show consequences when gender-specific crimes aren't taken seriously. The role of historical scholarship in recovering marginalized voices is central to this story. Feminist historians who specifically researched women's war experiences, who questioned why existing narratives excluded women, who sought out survivors and encouraged them to share their stories. These scholars performed essential work. Their research created foundation for current understanding of female POW experiences. But scholarship alone isn't sufficient. Historical knowledge must be transmitted through education, commemorated through memorials, recognized through official acknowledgments, and incorporated into how societies remember and teach about war. This transmission requires effort across many domains and sustained over time. Museums and memorials have begun updating exhibits to include female POW experiences more prominently. This represents important progress. Visitors to these institutions now encounter more complete narratives that include women's voices. But many museums haven't yet updated their exhibits. Many memorials still focus exclusively on male experiences. Continued advocacy is needed to ensure comprehensive representation. Educational curricula in schools increasingly include some content on women's war experiences, but coverage remains limited and uneven. Many students still learn about World War II primarily through narratives of male military experiences. Expanding educational content to include female POWs and other overlooked groups requires ongoing effort by educators, curriculum developers, and educational authorities. The media representation of POW experiences has been dominated by stories of male prisoners. Films, television programs, documentaries, and books have created popular understanding of POWs that centers male experiences. Changing this requires creating media that tells women's stories. Some progress has been made. Documentaries about female POWs, films incorporating women's experiences, books by and about female survivors, but these remain relatively rare compared to male-focused POW narratives. The challenge of creating such media is partly practical. Fewer documented stories, fewer living survivors to interview, less public awareness, creating smaller perceived audience. But it's also cultural. Stories of male military heroism and suffering have established audience and cultural resonance. Stories of female prisoners haven't been as culturally validated or valorized. Creating audience for these stories requires changing cultural attitudes about whose experiences matter and deserve attention. This cultural shift is happening gradually. Increasing awareness of gender issues, growing recognition of the importance of diverse historical perspectives, and specific advocacy around female POW experiences are all contributing to change. But progress is slow and requires sustained effort. The intergenerational trauma from female POWs to their descendants is an area receiving increasing attention from researchers. Children and grandchildren of survivors have been affected by family trauma, even when they didn't fully understand its source. Some survivors were unable to provide secure emotional environments for their children because their own emotional well-being was so compromised by trauma. Others were overprotective, transmitting their anxiety to the next generation. Still others were emotionally distant, leaving children feeling something was wrong, but not understanding what. As more information has emerged about female POW experiences, some descendants have gained understanding of family patterns that previously seemed mysterious. Learning that a grandmother was a POW who endured terrible trauma helps explain her behavior, her silences, her emotional unavailability. This understanding can be healing for descendants, even as it reveals painful family history. Some descendants have become advocates for recognition of female POW experiences. They conduct research, write about their relatives' experiences, push for memorials and official acknowledgments. This advocacy honors their relatives while contributing to broader historical recovery. The psychological research on trauma survivors has advanced significantly since World War II. We now understand much more about how trauma affects people long-term, how it's transmitted intergenerationally, and how it can be treated. This knowledge helps us understand what female POW survivors experienced psychologically, even when they didn't have a language to describe it at the time. Many survivors suffered from what we now recognize as PTSD: nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, avoidance of trauma reminders, emotional numbing. But in their time, this wasn't understood as a medical condition requiring treatment. Survivors were expected to get over it and move on. Without proper treatment, many suffered for decades with severe symptoms. Contemporary trauma-informed care could have helped these survivors significantly. The lack of such care represents another way survivors were failed by the systems that should have supported them. Understanding this historical failure informs current efforts to ensure that survivors of contemporary conflicts receive appropriate psychological care.
The economic consequences of captivity were also significant. Years lost to imprisonment disrupted careers and earning potential. Women who might have advanced in professions or built businesses instead spent years in camps, then struggled to reestablish themselves afterward. Some never fully recovered economically. This economic impact affected not just survivors, but their families. Children grew up with less financial security than they might have had if their mothers hadn't been imprisoned. The compensation systems established after the war were inadequate and often excluded female POWs entirely. Military nurses received some benefits, but these rarely reflected the full economic impact of their imprisonment. Civilian women received little or nothing. This failure to provide adequate compensation added economic hardship to the other burdens survivors carried. The social stigma female POWs faced was more severe than what male prisoners experienced. Male POWs were generally honored as heroes who had endured captivity with courage. Female POWs were more likely to face suspicion, judgment, or dismissal. This reflected broader gender dynamics where women's suffering and sacrifice were devalued compared to men's. Some female survivors faced direct accusations of collaboration or moral impropriety. Rumors circulated about women who had been prisoners, often focusing on implications of sexual misconduct rather than honoring their survival and resilience. These rumors were sometimes spread by former male POWs who either didn't understand what women had faced or who used gender-based attacks to diminish women's experiences. The effect was to silence many women and discourage them from seeking recognition or sharing their stories. They learned that speaking about their experiences invited judgment rather than honor. This silencing effect contributed significantly to historical erasure of women's POW experiences. The solidarity among female POW survivors has been important for many women's healing and advocacy. Organizations of former prisoners provided support networks where survivors could connect with others who understood their experiences. These organizations, however, were often dominated by male former POWs. Women members sometimes felt marginalized within organizations that supposedly represented all former prisoners. Some women formed separate organizations specifically for female former POWs. These provided spaces where women could discuss experiences they couldn't comfortably share in mixed groups. They organized reunions, supported each other through health crises, and advocated collectively for recognition. The friendships formed in camps often lasted lifetimes. Women who had supported each other during captivity maintained connections afterward. These relationships provided validation and understanding that family members who hadn't shared the experience couldn't fully provide. The annual reunions and regular correspondence among former fellow prisoners helped many survivors cope with their ongoing trauma. The contemporary relevance of female POW experiences extends to multiple areas. In conflict zones today, women continue to face gender-specific vulnerabilities. Understanding historical patterns helps inform efforts to protect women in current conflicts. International humanitarian organizations have developed protocols for addressing gender-based violence, supporting pregnant women and mothers in displacement, and providing gender-sensitive humanitarian assistance. These protocols reflect lessons learned partly from the historical cases like female POWs in World War II. The legal framework for prosecuting gender-based war crimes has improved significantly since World War II. The Rome Statute explicitly recognizes sexual violence, forced pregnancy, and related crimes. International tribunals have successfully prosecuted such crimes in recent conflicts. But challenges remain. Prosecution rates are still low. Survivors often face obstacles in seeking justice. Cultural stigma around sexual violence continues to discourage reporting. The historical pattern of inadequate accountability for crimes against women persists, though advocates continue working to improve it. The documentation challenges that affected recovery of female POW experiences remain relevant for contemporary conflicts. If experiences aren't documented systematically as events unfold, historical record will be incomplete. Advocacy organizations work to document gender-based violence in current conflicts, recognizing that without such documentation, these crimes will be overlooked, just as crimes against female POWs were overlooked for decades. The importance of survivor testimony is another lesson from female POW history with contemporary application. Survivors' voices are essential for understanding experiences of violence and for pursuing justice. Creating environments where survivors feel safe sharing their experiences requires addressing stigma, providing support, and ensuring testimony is taken seriously. Efforts to support survivors of contemporary conflicts increasingly recognize these needs. Trauma-informed care, psychological support, economic assistance, and legal advocacy all contribute to supporting survivors and enabling them to share their experiences if they choose. The intergenerational effects of conflict trauma are increasingly recognized. Children and grandchildren of survivors may be affected by family trauma. Understanding these intergenerational patterns, informed partly by research on descendants of female POWs and other World War II survivors, helps inform programs supporting families affected by contemporary conflicts. The broader lessons about historical memory and whose voices are included in narratives apply beyond war contexts. In many areas of history, certain groups' experiences have been systematically overlooked. Recovery of these experiences requires deliberate effort, questioning of existing narratives, and commitment to inclusive historical practice. The methodology developed for recovering female POW experiences, seeking out survivors, examining fragmentary documents, questioning why certain voices were excluded, using gender analysis to understand different experiences, can be applied to recovering other marginalized historical voices. The ethical imperative to document experiences before survivors die applies to many historical contexts. Whether documenting experiences of female POWs, Holocaust survivors, victims of genocides, survivors of oppressive regimes, or other historical groups, there is an urgency to record testimony while survivors are still living. Organizations working on historical documentation feel this urgency across multiple projects. They're racing against time to interview elderly survivors of various historical events before testimony is lost forever. The lessons about systematic historical erasure and the effort required to counteract it apply broadly. Historical narratives don't automatically represent all perspectives. They reflect choices, biases, and power structures that shape what gets documented and remembered. Ensuring comprehensive historical understanding requires constantly questioning whose voices are missing and working deliberately to recover those voices. As we approach the conclusion of this examination, several themes emerge that summarize the significance of female POW experiences and their historical recovery. Female prisoners of war held by Japanese forces during World War II endured terrible suffering. Their experiences were comparable in severity to male POW experiences with additional gender-specific challenges. After liberation, they received inadequate support, recognition, and justice. Their experiences were systematically excluded from historical narratives for decades due to multiple intersecting factors, including gender bias, cultural taboos, documentation gaps, and political considerations. Recovering these experiences has required deliberate effort by historians, survivors, and advocates over the past several decades. Significant progress has been made in documenting and understanding female POW experiences, but much work remains. The window for direct testimony from survivors is closing as the last survivors reach advanced age.
Continued effort is needed to ensure these stories are preserved, incorporated into mainstream historical understanding, and properly honored through memorials, education, and official recognition. The women who survived captivity demonstrated extraordinary resilience and courage. They deserve recognition not as victims requiring pity, but as survivors who endured terrible conditions and rebuilt their lives afterward. Their willingness to eventually share their stories, despite cultural pressures towards silence, has made historical recovery possible. The lessons from their experiences remain relevant for understanding contemporary conflicts, improving legal frameworks for addressing war crimes, supporting survivors, and ensuring that historical narratives include diverse voices. The project of recovering female POW experiences is part of a broader effort to make history more complete and honest. It represents a commitment to including all voices, particularly those that have been systematically marginalized. It represents a recognition that understanding the past requires examining how power structures shape both events and historical memory. For those of us learning these stories decades later, we have responsibilities. We must honor survivors by taking their experiences seriously, by ensuring their stories are preserved and transmitted to future generations, by supporting continued documentation efforts, and by applying lessons from their experiences to contemporary challenges. We must recognize that historical narratives are never neutral or complete. They reflect choices about whose voices to include and whose to overlook. Being critical consumers and producers of history means constantly asking whose perspectives are missing and working to recover those perspectives. We must acknowledge the systematic failures that allowed female POW experiences to be overlooked for so long. Failures of documentation, failures of justice, failures of recognition, failures of historical scholarship. Acknowledging these failures is necessary for ensuring they aren't repeated.
We must appreciate the work done by those who have labored to recover these stories, the historians who questioned existing narratives, the advocates who pushed for recognition, the survivors who broke decades of silence to share their experiences. Their efforts have made current understanding possible. The story of overlooked female POWs and their erasure from history is ultimately about power. Who has power to define what's historically significant? Who has power to decide whose voices matter? Who has power to shape collective memory? Understanding this helps us recognize that historical recovery is always political. It involves challenging existing power structures and narratives. It involves asserting that marginalized voices matter and deserve to be heard. It involves using historical understanding to inform contemporary action toward justice. The women who are prisoners of war held by Japanese forces during World War II deserved better than what they received. Better treatment during captivity, better support after liberation, better recognition afterward, and better incorporation into historical memory. They didn't receive what they deserved in their lifetimes. But we can ensure that future generations know their stories, understand their experiences, and learn from their example of resilience and survival. This represents belated justice, inadequate but important. The final responsibility falls to each generation to decide how to remember and honor the past. Currently, we have opportunity and responsibility to ensure female POW experiences are preserved and transmitted accurately. This requires continued documentation, continued scholarship, continued education, continued commemoration, and continued advocacy. It requires recognizing that historical work is never finished. Each generation must recommit to comprehensive and honest historical understanding. It requires understanding that some voices have been systematically excluded, and that including them requires deliberate, sustained effort. It requires honoring not just the experiences of those who suffered, but the work of those who have labored to ensure those experiences are remembered. The women who were prisoners of war held by Japanese forces during World War II carried burdens that few of us can fully comprehend. They endured terrible conditions, faced gender-specific challenges, received inadequate support afterward, and watched their experiences be erased from historical narratives. That their stories are finally being recovered and told is progress. That it took 80 years is an indictment of systems that devalued their experiences. As survivors pass away, taking their direct testimony with them, we're left with a documentary record they helped create and a moral imperative to preserve it and honor it. Their legacy includes the stories they shared, the advocacy they engaged in, and the historical documentation they contributed to. But their legacy should also include a commitment by subsequent generations to ensure no group's wartime experiences are similarly overlooked in the future. The recovery of female POW experiences teaches us that historical silence can be broken, that marginalized voices can be recovered, and that historical narratives can be revised to be more complete and honest. But it also teaches us how much effort such recovery requires and how much is lost when documentation is delayed. These lessons should inform how we document current events. We should attend to whose voices are being recorded and who's overlooked. We should recognize gender-specific experiences and conflicts. We should ensure that documentation systems capture diverse perspectives. We should support survivors in sharing their stories. And we should commit to historical practices that resist erasure of marginalized voices. The women who were prisoners of war held by Japanese forces during World War II deserved our remembrance, our respect, our continued efforts to honor their experiences, and our commitment to learning from their stories. They were nurses, missionaries, teachers, mothers, daughters, wives. They were serving their countries or living their lives when war overtook them. They became prisoners through no fault of their own. They survived conditions designed to break them. They carried trauma that affected their entire lives. And many eventually found courage to share their experiences, contributing to historical understanding. Their stories are part of the larger story of World War II, part of the story of how war affects women specifically, part of the story of historical erasure and recovery, and part of the story of human resilience and survival. They deserve to be told completely, remembered accurately, and honored appropriately. This examination of overlooked female POW experiences and their erasure from history is offered as a contribution to that ongoing work of remembrance, recovery, and honor. May the women who suffered and survived be remembered. May their stories be preserved and transmitted. May the lessons from their experiences inform our understanding and action. And may we commit to ensuring that no group's experiences are similarly erased from historical memory in the future.